graduated, elevated. Now it's my time to shine, yeah, let's go. Major moves, power moves, take it to the top one time, non-stop.
Lovely. Now to move on to your book, hopefully I'll pronounce this correctly. Subversion, Power and Hierarchy in Organizations and Society. Carnivalesque is why... Oh. Is that where I stopped?
You're absolutely fine with that. Yeah. So the idea of the book is around carnivalesque leadership. And this is where I draw on the work of that Russian philosopher, Mikhail Bakhtin, who did a lot of work in the 20th century on folk culture. And one of the things that he did so much, you know, he's a language-based philosopher. He did an awful lot of work on the writings of the French medieval writer Rabelais, and that's really where his ideas of carnival comes from. But I was really interested ever since it was introduced to me in my undergraduate program around the idea of carnivalesque and power and freedom and subversion. So what Bakhtin does is he talks about the power relationships and how there is a moment within culture or organizations and society whereby the power is subverted and normal expectations paused. And for me, that's really of interest when it comes to leadership, because I think we do this all the time, but I think it's almost invisible. We're not seeing it as a strategy. And then I was thinking, okay, well, does that just mean that we build compliance? Because if we're operating a safety valve system, so that might be in the form of organised team building, it might be a trip to the pub on a Friday, it might be an end of term school teacher, end of term do, it might be the end of financial year celebration. It might be one of those glorious perks you get in some of the high paid jobs where you're whisked off to Australia for a weekend, something like that. But what that does is it suddenly breaks the routine. And for me, it's, well, are we then just letting out the pressure to come back more compliant? Do we then feel a greater sense of belonging to the organisation or the element of society? Because the pressure's gone, we feel grateful, possibly, to our bosses around that pressure being let out, and then we come back more compliant and we feel that we belong. So that's something I wanted to explore. And what I've done is I've looked at various sectors. So I've gone full Carnival in chapter 3, where I've looked at the Trinidad Carnival and Notting Hill Carnival in terms of the organisation of those and the history of those, because the power imbalances throughout history in those particular carnivals are very interesting when it comes to carnivalesque leadership. I've then looked at the education sector across the globe. I think we inculcate the idea of safety valve release for compliance in schools across the world. So that's that chapter. I then do some work on corporate carnivalesque, and that's where I'm looking at things like standardization of leisure time, the idea of works teams. They might be sports teams, for example. So big football clubs like Arsenal, Manchester United, West Ham, Crystal Palace, they come from works teams. And that's a classic example of safety valve release, which can then build compliance and belonging to an organisation. And then finally, I use pride as an example of where that initial, that moment of safety valve release can actually lead to longer term change. Because I don't think it's as simple as saying we'd simply let out the pressure, we then get greater compliance. I don't think it's just that, because that space, that liminal space where you get different relationships, subverted power, opportunities to understand each other in a very different way, that can lead to such long-term transformation. I use pride as an example of that. So that's the book. So I go from a very tight discussion on backed in, and his philosophy, to suddenly applying it in very different contexts. So hopefully that gives you a sense of carnivalesque leadership.
It really does. And the question I have is, looking at the UK, and then we'll go global. We're very multicultural, and we have first generation, and then we have also, I would say, migrant workers, to put it that way. And then we have other people that came, and when I say other people, other generations that came in due to all the challenges that we're having, be it Jamaica that were brought in the 1940s, etc. And in terms of our cultural dynamics, we may be from Jamaica 1940 and now we're fourth generation. Our behaviors and cultural understanding differs, and it changes, and it influences our behaviors in the workplace. Now, to go to the carnival, in terms of Notting Hill Carnival, from how it was, how it started in terms of planning to where it is now, because I've had friends who've participated in the planning and the dancing, etc., coming from the other islands as well, within the Caribbean islands. So what have you identified as a key change, and why is that important in terms of our cultural dynamics? Because they come with different, I would assume, pride levels, because I'm not as proud as somebody older than me, I think, when it comes to culture and understanding and the knowledge.
I think we're seeing almost like the globalisation of Carnival as a standardised product. But I'm going to take that back to the Trinidad Carnival tradition, because that model in particular is so important when it comes to Notting Hill. On top of that, we also have this more Rio-based Mardi Gras like mass costume, and a very different sense of, well, what does Mardi Gras mean now compared to what it would have meant in the 19th century, for example, in Trinidad, and that colonial element that was so fundamental to the history of Carnival in Trinidad, and that power imbalance and the subversion potential and the longer term transformation. In terms of the Notting Hill Carnival today, I think it's fair to say it is far more standardized than it was. It is a global tourist attraction in a way that's underestimated, I think, because the mainstream press will often be negative about the Notting Hill Carnival. I'm paying real attention to whether or not Jovet, that break of dawn activity and the pure joy of that is actually back on the agenda this year. Because it didn't actually happen last year, and that actually went under the radar a little bit. And if we're thinking about power, and we're thinking about transformation, and we're thinking about culture, the removal of that opportunity on the Sunday morning was significant, and that's part of the stripping away potentially of the real heritage around the Notting Hill Carnival, which is an area that, as I say, didn't get a lot of coverage, but it concerns me, and I'm keen to know what the plans are for this year.
No, lovely. So, with the media, because we control the narrative as we're talking today, people hear, essentially what we're saying. With my assumption is that there's fears, because there's usually stabbings, these shootings, in terms of it's amazing to go to, but you have that fear because you don't know if someone will get stabbed next to you while you're dancing and having the time of your life. And from a health and safety perspective, do you think that was one of the decisions or influences that made the team decide to say, no, actually, we'll leave that to another year because of all these stabbings that have happened over the past few years?
Well, I'll come back to the Jovet lack of support last summer, the summer that's just gone, because that was one of the parts of the whole experience where there was just this joyous sense of celebration and tradition, without the same potential threat level because it was smaller scale. You know, we are talking about an event that has millions of people attend over the weekend, millions of people. Whenever you have a huge amount of people, there are inevitably moments of tension, and policing is involved, and it does cost a lot to police. Of course it does. It also brings in an awful lot of money as well, and again we get those kind of balances. That's not to minimize, of course, the threat and the challenge. And you know, people lost their lives last year, and clearly no event, no matter what the scale is, you don't want that to happen, but it's not an inevitable consequence of the carnival. It's not. There will be particular people involved in any event, any particular mass event where you have this potential, but clearly it's not the Notting Hill Carnival that generates that.
Lovely, thank you. Now going back to diversity, equity and inclusion. Looking at Carnivalesque, right, and we're looking at women in the workplace because, well, my research focuses on women, so that's why I'm asking the question. We have other responsibilities outside of the workplace. And when it's time, and I'll use this word strategically, play within the workplace, sometimes we can't make it to these corporate events, essentially. How do we fit into that model? Because it's so expensive nowadays in terms of cost of living and childcare to afford somebody to babysit for you to attend something because your husband works too or your partner works too. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that the best kind of employers will take that into consideration. And so you can have, for example, carnivalesque release, safety valve release during the work day. And that is, you know, some of the most advanced organizations have that operating so that you don't get the same level of exclusion. And if we think about that quality leadership and that awareness, then you would see that in those most successful organizations, because we do need that safety valve release. Genuinely believe that we do need that, but it doesn't have to be in the evening. It doesn't have to be at the weekend. If you're saying that this is so important, that what we're actually going to do is suspend normal routine, even it's for an afternoon, and we do something different at that point, you can achieve the same ideas around well-being, the release of chemical messengers, the release of individual and group tension from a work environment, subversing those existing power relationships. So, for example, if let's go with this for a second, I'm going to go extreme. If we're not talking about some glamorous event in the evening or at the weekend, but say, for example, we have a Thursday cake day, or we have a knitting event. I'm just going with it, just forgive me for that. But whatever, it doesn't make any difference. It is the break of routine. It is that is the mechanism and the opportunity to do something different and to have different conversations, and just to learn more about each other. Because then when we go back to normal, there is a difference. Something has changed at that point. And it's interesting to see how that happens. And I'm going to give you another example, if that's okay. Pepsi Max is hosting an indoor snowball fight. And this is an opportunity for small groups of people to go in. They've sold out now, I have to say that. So if you were that kind of boss, and if you're local to Soho, you could take your crew down to the Pepsi Max snow experience. Then you can go and chuck snowballs at each other for a 2-hour period. And that's the most obvious example of carnivalesque leadership that I can give you at this point, which is topical to now. I think it opens next week. There are some tickets on doors, I believe. But they're quite as levelling as a snowball in the chops for a leader from somebody else on their team, because suddenly you get very different sense, different dynamics, etc. I'm not suggesting you should attack your boss with snowballs, but it does give an example because it's open during the day as well as in the evening. And so you don't have to do things outside of work time. Is it harder to justify for a leader? Possibly. but what are you actually trying to achieve here? And that's where the strategy of Carnivalesque leadership needs to come in. If you want to build belonging, if you want to build compliance, if you want to build a sense of the group and the understanding of each other, take 3 hours from a workday, because you will get that back in kind over and over again. And so I think it's naive of leaders who are trapped in the idea it has to be beyond normal work times, which can then exclude, as you started off with your question, it can exclude people in an unhelpful way, which will pay dividends at some point for them to be included, of course.
Lovely. So I'm going to share a story with you. So I used to work for a big business in the UK. I've signed an NDA. I can't mention who they are. What we used to do is from planting to manufacturing to logistics and to getting it out to retail. What we used to do is we used to get to the Christmas period and we'll get all the workers from the shop floor. We would actually make the food, serve them the food in terms of what they wanted. And they used to enjoy that so much and take pictures with us, essentially, and watch us struggle, on the shop floor. And they would laugh, essentially, and vice versa in terms of logistics, etc. And, it was the biggest event for our staff within that business. And they used to look forward to it, and they'll ask us to wear different outfits, just because they enjoyed it so much. And we also got to understand what they go through in terms of the actual job itself, which was quite difficult, I might add. I think I underestimated that part. Would you say that's linking into Carnivalesque leadership, or would you say no?
Oh, it's a classic example of Carnivalesque leadership, because what you've done is you've suspended the normal routine, you subverted the power structures. I mean, that's very Roman Saturnalian, actually, what's happened. So you've gone back to ancient times at that point, where the leaders are doing the serving. And Bakhtin talks about that in his book, because that is such a reversal of normal power hierarchy. And it enables an understanding of other people's experiences, and it is a respectful means to just pause on that normal power structure. So we see people differently at that point, and we understand more. And in that space, that fun space, the tension is let out of the system, ready to go back in with a greater sense of belonging and probably a greater compliance as well.
Lovely. So in terms of leadership, as we know it, we have to have a relationship with our staff or our line manager, essentially. That's what helps us to move forward in terms of our career development if we're not in a dead-end job, essentially. So looking at Carnivalesque then, do you link it to leader-member exchange theory or social exchange theory in your book, or do you just mainly focus on Carnivalesque?
I mainly focus on the Carnivalesque. I do some linkage into transformational and transactional theory more than any others, but it's very much about establishing the strategy behind Carnivalesque. And that was a decision that I made in terms of writing the book. How much other leadership theory do I want to bring in, or do I want to try and maintain the purity of approaching this as a Carnivalesque leadership approach? I could have gone the other way, to be honest, but because this happens, Carnivalesque leadership happens all the time. You've given me a great example, and that will be in my second book. Thank you, Noma. We'll be in touch.
You're welcome.
Because it just happens, but you can see it happens all the time, but it feels invisible and it feels like it's not a strategy. And if we can understand, if leaders can understand that this is actually a really valid strategy that is so ingrained in culture and organizations, that understanding how it works, we can be more effective. We can create a greater sense of well-being and belonging through strategically applying Carnivalesque, and also at that point be aware of not excluding people as well. So if the end of year do is a do in the evening, understanding that will exclude. Do you want that to exclude? And if not, then do something else, because you will achieve the same kind of feelings the same overall impact by doing things simply by breaking that normal routine.
Lovely. So going back to what you stated earlier, which was you've looked at the education system, you've looked at SMEs. Was it any different for smaller businesses compared to the bigger businesses or institutions, to put it that way?
I think the mechanisms are the same. I think genuinely they are. I think actually a smaller business, because you've got a smaller amount of people to support, you can do more carnivalesque actually. The high profile examples I give in chapter 5 of my book really do focus on the origins of the Industrial Revolution. Big organisations like Bass, and this is Bass Brewery in Burton, they used to hire 8 or 10 trains every summer, and they used to take their entire workforce to the seaside.
Wow.
Now that's huge. That's a big thing to have done. Would have been incredibly costly, etc., etc. But the Bass excursions are a classic example of how this was operating during the Industrial Revolution. This has led into the 19th century, and those kind of examples do show us how big business can do it. You would also find examples through Google. The way that they operate can be very carnivalesque. I see Richard Branson's Virgin offering so many examples of carnivalesque leadership, because he brings fun into the workplace and has that sense of well-being, belonging and potential compliance through that. And so we do see it in the big businesses. But as I say, if you are a small business owner, I would urge you to consider what you do around carnivalesque safety valve release, so that you have a greater sense of belonging, you understand each other better, but it's controlled in a way, not in a kind of autocratic way, but controlled and strategized in a way that you can maximize the potential and include as many people as possible.
Lovely. This links into my next question. I don't know if you know about this, but allegedly, well, according to reports anyway, on HR Grapevine, Yahoo at the moment, they've decided to axe all of their performance reviews, because they say we're all grown-ups in the workplace. We know why we're here. So why should we essentially sit down with you to go over this to increase your cheddar or not? So the question I have is, businesses at the moment, they're trying to survive. That's how I would put it. But they're also starting to realize that people, due to technology, they're willing to now work for a US-based company instead of a UK one, because if the culture is not working and they feel like I can work from home and look after my family and go to the gym, Pilates, at 5:30, why should I come and work for you? Let me go to, work for a US-based company. So the question that I'm trying to ask is, looking at, Carnivalesque and looking at what Yahoo's doing at the moment, do you think this is moving towards a different way of management just in order for businesses to survive? Or do you think businesses have actually learned from high turnovers and the cost of taking people out and them still leaving the business? Or do you think, no, Noma, you're reaching too far?
I think there are links. I think there are genuine links. And I'm going to use the example of the education sector, because I think there's similarities here. So traditionally, what would happen is that performance management targets would be set at the start of an academic year. They would then be reviewed in about February to see whether or not we're on track, or whether or not there is additional support or opportunities needed at that point. And then those targets are returned to see whether or not they're met. If they are met, if you're on the right point of the scale, you will then move up in terms of a salary. So that's a very transactional model. It's a very kind of established, old-fashioned way in which a leader can ensure that the outcomes that they set are met through that transaction. If you do this, you get this in return. Some schools are moving away from that, and that's going to be interesting to see how that develops over the coming years, because we have so much focus now in education about understanding culture. And culture doesn't necessarily come through transaction, because if you're simply dealing with targets and potential sanctions and rewards from targets, it has limited impact. And the greater understanding of how we can build organisations which ensure that people feel that they belong, that there is a sense of well-being, that there is an appropriate workload, and that the vision and values of the individual member of staff are aligned to the wider vision and values of that particular organisation. So that makes the transactional model seem very outdated at that point. How quickly that moves to that as a sector will be incredibly interesting, because those appraisal structures are so entrenched in school life and in terms of teacher profession. So that will be interesting to see. But in terms of the way in which leaders can have impact without setting such things as that transactional model, anything that we can do around well-being, safety valve release, understanding each other better through things like carnivalesque release. And at that point, it doesn't need to be a snowball fight or a knitting club or a Thursday cake day. It can be whatever suits your organisation at that point, because we then get buy-in and we then get a sense of compliance through a very different route. And again, I think I probably need to say this isn't something I'm making up. This is something that already exists. What I'm trying to do is to help leaders to understand where it's already operating in their organisations and how it can be strategically used to maximise its impact.
Lovely. And this links into New Labour or Labour, whichever way we want to look at it. They've basically, there is chatter in terms of new bills that will affect HR policies as we know them now, and how we function as businesses, linking into the probation policy that most businesses have. Now, linking into the Carnivalesque theory, how does that look like in the near future? Because if we're saying employees come in from day one, they have the same rights as everyone else, does that change how we then release, or does that look the same?
I think it would look the same. I think the impact will be on recruitment processes and induction processes more than anything else, because in terms of that change in legislation, I think the onus will be on the front side of the recruitment process, rather than once somebody is fully embedded as an employee. But that induction phase, that's going to be the crucial one, I think, for employers and employees, to make sure that the fit is right for both. And it you know, that legislation doesn't mean that everybody joins an organisation that it feels right for them or is the right thing for them. There will still be flex within the workforce, but having rights from the initial point of taking on and making that commitment to you being employed by somebody else. You would have left another job probably to join another organisation, and therefore for you not to have those same rights on day one is incredibly problematic from an employer's perspective, of course. Who you get at interview, who you get on your CV, they feel very different to the person that walks through the door, and clearly that's where the recruitment and the induction phase becomes so important.
Lovely, which links into the next question. So as an elevator pitch, why should I go and buy your book?
Well, as an academic, I would encourage you to open your reading scope to explore something very different and yet familiar, which is what my book does. I'm very interested in establishing links to universities and to leadership professionals through this book. As a kind of starting point. So I wanted to write an academic version first, which is what I've done. And thank you to Routledge for supporting me with that. The idea, absolutely.
Thumbs up.
What I'm looking to do now is to take some of these ideas more mainstream, because I want people to have access to that understanding as quickly as possible. Because as I've said, as I've repeated, it is a bit of a hobby horse, but this happens. Do leaders use it? Do they apply it? Do they understand it? The strategy behind it? Probably not, because we don't talk about it. It's just a thing that happens. And so I'm very keen to go mainstream with some of these ideas. Any publishers out there, please do get in touch. But as a starting point, I really wanted to explore Bakhtin. I wanted to look at some of the research behind it, and to talk about the problems with the theory, which is what this book also does as well. So I'm not sure that's encouraged you to read the book, Noma, but I would very much love it if some people started to really get hold of this and to explore the mechanisms behind carnivalesque leadership.
No, lovely, well put, essentially. And we will be buying the book. So the details will be at the bottom, and you may get in contact with Jo as well. Details will be at the bottom. Now, for the final question, why did you want to be a guest on PhD Hard Talk?
Well, I started to come across your work and PhD Hard Talk through LinkedIn, and that was a really useful platform for me to understand. I suppose that some of the mechanisms that are now in place through this, I'm going to call it new media, it's not anymore, but this as an opportunity simply didn't exist when I was doing my PhD. And it's glorious, just the opportunity to hear different voices, different experiences, to help with the motivation, which, as I've said before, can be incredibly isolating. So any opportunity for me to contribute to something which helps and opens up dialogue from what can be a very isolating experience, I'm very happy to do.
Lovely. So thank you so much, Jo, for your time this morning. And in terms of Carnivalesque, I've learnt so much, and I can't wait to actually read the book and go through the different techniques, because I think in the world that we live in, with working from home, hybrid working, this is very much in. It will help us understand those dynamics, because usually we're used to being face to face and you can read the body language, like you touched on previously. But now it's like you're having to read someone's body language via a screen, which can be challenging for some people, and some people are shy, they don't put on their videos. So you're talking to somebody, just hearing a voice, which affects your work relationship as well in terms of dynamics, going back to performance management, probation policy, and just looking at the carnival itself. It is a wonderful thing in terms of Notting Hill Carnival. But the challenge is, like you said, in terms of the media, because if you go on Google right now, the first thing that you see, 3 people shot, 1 person stabbed. You don't see the beauty of what it is, and also the planning that goes into it in terms of the different cultures that come together and unite in order for the carnival for it to be what it is, essentially. So thank you so much for educating us today, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Thank you, Noma.